Hello and welcome to Faith at Home Going Deeper, episode 5. And this week's theme is patience. And earlier in the week, Nikki looked at the story of Abraham, which I think is a great story for looking at patience. So for those of you that don't know, Abraham's in Genesis of the Bible, which is right at the front. The story starts in chapter 12 and actually goes all the way through to chapter 26. But rather than sort of read the lot, I think I'm just going to pick out a few key points. Starting with actually the very beginning there, where God actually calls Abraham. God says this to Abraham: "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household into a land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all the people on earth will be blessed through you." And then later on in that sort of same bit in verse 7, it says, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he talks about showing him a land, and to your offspring I'll give that land. So right there at the very beginning, God's saying go to Abraham and giving him a promise that he will make him a great nation. And at this point, Abraham's 75, he doesn't have any kids, so a promise that he'll become a great nation, that his offspring will get a land, probably seems a little bit far-fetched. But then only a couple of chapters later, in chapter 15, verse 4, God says this to Abraham again. He says, "This man will not be your heir, but a son coming from your own body will be your heir." He took him outside and said, "Look up at the heavens and count the stars, if you indeed can count them." Then he said to him, "So your offspring will be." So at this time he's still not had a son, but God's really reaffirming that promise that actually he will. We see in chapter 17, Abraham passes the grand old age of 99, still without a son. And eventually in chapter 21, Abraham has a son and Isaac is born. But from that original promise back in chapter 12, when Abraham's 75, all the way through to when Isaac is born, at least 25 years later, Abraham is waiting. Abraham is being patient, and Abraham is waiting on God to fulfill the promise that he gave him. But what I really like about Abraham is how he waits for God. You see, he's patient, but actually there's a lot of chapters between the original promise in chapter 12 and Isaac being born in chapter 21. And at the beginning, God calls Abraham to go, and Abraham went. He didn't sort of like, "Well, you promised me this first, God. Well, let's do this, and then I'll go." Actually, God called Abraham to go, and Abraham went, and God gave him a promise, and Abraham was sort of trusting that God would fulfill that promise. And we see, between chapter 12 and chapter 21, we don't just see several chapters of Abraham sat on his bottom, doing nothing, twiddling his thumbs, waiting for God to fulfill the promise. Actually, what we see is Abraham going on a journey with God. Abraham getting deeper with God. Abraham getting into a new relationship with God all that time, pressing on with God and finding out what God is calling him to be. Trusting that God is a God that keeps his promises, but not waiting for that. He's being patient for God to fulfill that promise, but his waiting in it is not static. He's not confusing patience with inactivity. And that's not to say God doesn't call us to times of rest, because he does. But actually, Abraham is listening to what God is saying to him within that waiting and patience. And I liken it to a bit like this. I'm married to Nikki. And at one point I proposed to Nikki, and then I didn't speak to her until we're married. Sounds daft, doesn't it? But the idea that I made a promise to Nikki, and until that promise was fulfilled, that was it. Everything was on pause. But it just didn't happen like that. Actually, just because I proposed to Nikki, I made a promise to her that we'd get married, we still grew together in our relationship. We still got to know each other more, all up until the day where the promise was fulfilled on our wedding day. And actually, I think, when we trust in the promise of God, it has to be a bit like that. It has to be that the promise, if God promises something to you, we don't just hang about for Him to fulfill it. We wait patiently while still obeying what He is calling us to do. And actually, I think that idea is a particular key one, considering that at the moment we're a church without a vicar. We're an entire church waiting patiently. But we're an entire church, not called to inactivity, but called to do what God is calling us to do in this time period. And we should be listening to that. We should be pressing at what God has for us and growing in Him as individuals and as a church. I'm going to leave you with a song, Strength Will Rise as We Wait Upon the Lord. And I just want you to listen to it, and as you listen to it, are you waiting on something from God? But actually, how are you waiting? Are you still growing with God? Are you still moving forward with Him in that time? Because I think that is really what we're called to do. Amen.